The colleagues and dear friends from the Argentine forensic anthropology team have continued to form and to be a source of guidance and inspiration for forensic practitioners from around the world. I have no doubt that the team will be regarded in due time as a true cornerstone in the development of humanitarian forensic sciences. Clyde Snow, whose humanity and generosity are conspicuously large as his Texan boots and cowboy hat in a small Buenos Aires cafe, like the ones he so much loves, immediately won the heart of the relatives of the missing, including the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, who never doubted in promoting and supporting his pioneering forensic contributions in Argentina. This was parallel to the grandmothers' extraordinary quest for their missing grandchildren, most of whom had been abducted with their parents and, unlike their parents, who were systematically murdered, were given out in adoption under false names. With the help of geneticists Mary Claire King and Cristiano Rego, who also participated in that first AAAFS delegation to Argentina, the grandmothers established their own forensic genetics team, which I am very proud of also having been part of. And they advocated for some of the first grandpaternity testing ever used in courts, based on phenotypic blood cell and serum markers, and the establishment of the Argentine National Genetic Data Bank for the search of the missing children, the first of its kind in the world, is owed entirely to the grandmothers, who later promptly incorporated DNA analysis when this became available for forensic purposes. Up to date, more than 100 of those missing children have been reunited with their original families thanks to the grandmothers' extraordinary work. The forensic evidence collected through those early investigations was used in trials against the former junta members and helped convince prosecutors, judges, and the public of its value and necessity. As importantly, the large international media coverage of the trials helped inform families of the missing the world over that forensic science could help bring answers to their quest for truth. As a result, by the end of the 80s, there were requests from many countries affected by armed conflict around the world for specialized forensic investigations and training, as well as a nascent interest from the international community, including the United Nations, in this novel field of application of forensic sciences. During the late 80s and 90s, the American non-governmental organization Physicians for Human Rights, PHR, played a prominent role in developing forensic best practices applied to human rights investigations. Those responsible for PHR's forensic program during the 80s and 90s, in particular Dr. Robert Kirshner, played an important role in the promotion and advancement in forensic sciences the world over and also at diplomatic level. Bob Kirshner, whom I had the pleasure and honor to work with in Argentina and elsewhere, was a leading force behind the development and adoption by the United Nations in 1989 of its manual on the effective prevention and investigation of extralegal, arbitrary, and summary executions, also known as the Minnesota Protocol. Together with Professor Jørgen Thomsen, head of the Medical Legal Institute of Southern Denmark, who also helped in the development of other benchmark international forensic standards, including for the Council of Europe. That manual has since served as a blueprint for numerous other UN documents on forensic sciences, including the UN Manual for the Investigation and Documentation of Torture, also known as Istanbul Protocol, and the so-called Snow Resolution on Human Rights and Forensic Sciences, adopted by the United Nations in 1992 in recognition for Clyde's contribution to its development. Developments at the United Nations, recognizing the value of forensic science, have since been mirrored by other intergovernmental organizations such as the Organization of American States. During the 90s, I was a privileged witness from a position as a desk officer at Amnesty International headquarters in London of the rapidly expanding use of forensic sciences, including the adoption of forensic capacity by numerous truth commissions established in many countries to document past violations, and it's used to address the consequences of bloody conflicts, including the Balkan Wars of the 90s and the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. That was a time when the pioneering but still very small group of forensic scientists and institutions from around the world dedicated to this work at international level became increasingly overstretched. The need for building up local forensic capacity and improving cooperation between different forensic institutions became growingly apparent. Some forensic services and institutes led the way on this regard. Perhaps most remarkably so, the Portuguese Institute of Legal Medicine, under the direction of Professor Duarte Nuno Vieira, which pioneered university outreach training programs in humanitarian forensic sciences. Professor Vieira's own restless commitment to help catapult forensic sciences to the attention and interest of the world's leading forensic associations cannot be overestimated. The tragedy of the missing from the Balkans catalyzed a genuine international effort for developing forensic best practices for the recovery, management, and identification of the dead. Investigations into the missing there helped to further raise awareness about the role and value of forensic science and help train numerous young professionals from around the world who volunteered to help in massive recovery and identification efforts. Many of them have since dedicated their careers fully to this field. From tragedy often springs ways to resolve its consequences. The Balkans crisis was no exception, and a good example of which is the ICMP, established in 1996 to help locate and identify the missing from that conflict, and which has pioneered the use of large-scale DNA analysis and its integration with other forensic identification methods for resolving thousands of cases of the missing, an approach which is now used by many forensic organizations and services around the world. Of course, many lessons were also learned from the investigations carried out during the 90s and early years of this century, including the need for quality assurance and control in mass recovery and identification efforts, and for taking into full consideration the needs of the bereaved, including their right to know. As importantly, the need for ensuring identifications of the dead was recognized as a central part of these investigations, which initially in the Balkans had been focused principally on establishing the cause and manner of death of victims of mass murder. Let's not forget that everybody's right to be identified after death was universally recognized only very recently, thanks to Interpol's General Assembly in 1996. Early investigations in the Balkans also reminded us all that forensic humanitarian action often takes place within loose institutional and legal frameworks and security-strained and resource-challenged contexts. It therefore requires special frameworks and logistical arrangements unknown of in most domestic settings. The 2003 International Conference on the Missing and Their Families was held precisely to address and help resolve those issues. In addition to legal and policy measures to prevent and resolve the missing from armed conflict, it proposed a series of recommendations on forensic best practices for humanitarian action. They were prepared by scores of leading forensic specialists and institutions from around the world, convened in Geneva for that purpose. Soon after, the International Committee of the Red Cross established a forensic unit for the first time in its 140-year-long existence. Professor Stephen Corner, director of the Victoria Institute of Forensic Medicine in Melbourne, Australia, was a leading force behind that conference, soon after which he was invited by the ICRC to set up its forensic services and deserves all the credit for having convinced the ICRC about the value and need for acquiring forensic capacity. After a year in Geneva, he had to return to the direction of his institute in Australia, and I was invited to take over the coordination of the unit that he had created. Those early years of the unit were not easy, when many colleagues in the ICRC were still unfamiliar with forensics and unimpressed with the idea of humanitarian action for the dead. I should mention here that the ICRC is a rather conservative institution founded in 1863 and mandated under international humanitarian law to protect and assist all victims of war. Its activities have in fact won the ICRC the Nobel Peace Prize Award on 3 occasions during its history. However, it had never before been involved in delivering forensic services. It therefore took some convincing to change its initial resistance towards forensics, thanks mostly to the results coming from the field, which proved beyond reasonable doubt the added value of forensic sciences for protecting the dignity of the dead and addressing the needs of the bereaved. Work of the unit grew geometrically from 3 operational contexts using forensic services in 2003 to more than 60 the world over today, with activities ranging from technical advice, training and material support, to developing tools and applicable standards of forensic best practice. The core objective of these activities is to help develop sustainable local forensic capacity where this is necessary for humanitarian purposes, and to empower cooperation between forensic professionals and institutions, including by convening and facilitating communication and exchanges between forensic services and practitioners at national, regional, and international level.